Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Now in this video I'm going to do a demonstration of a dogfight in Down in Flames Wild Blue Yonder. Those of you who have tuned into my introductory video on this game and who watched the rather long bombing mission I played with my good friend Ian, thank you very much for watching those. I hope you found them both enjoyable and useful. But I have had a comment, and it did occur to me as well that having leapt straight into a scenario that showed you just about everything this game had to offer, I didn't really get into showing you the basic building block of the Down in Flames system, which is of course the dogfight. So what I'm going to do in this video is just show you a very straightforward dogfight between a pair of Spitfire Mark 14s and a pair of Focke-Wulf 190As, and this probably would take place sometime, let's say it's around D-Day, both types were in service around that time, and these are the kind of fighters that would have clashed over the northern coast of France, so it's a good matchup. It also gives me a good opportunity to show you one special rule that affects quite a few aircraft in this game, and that is the turbocharged rule. So just a quick reminder of the anatomy of an aircraft card. You've got your lovely graphic and the I'll call it the bare bones information about the craft. That is your aircraft's strength in terms of how much damage it can absorb when the card is when the aircraft takes that level of damage, it's flipped over and the damage is carried over. That is its bombing capability. We won't worry about that too much because this is a dogfight scenario and I have explained bombing elsewhere in one of my videos. Performance is your maximum hand size. Bursts is an amalgamation of both the number of guns your aircraft possesses and how powerful they are. VH is the maximum ceiling altitude that your aircraft can attain. In that case, very high. It's the highest altitude in the game. There are 5 altitude bands in Down in Flames, ranging from very low to low, medium, high, and very high. Horsepower is how many cards you draw at the end of your turn. Now, if you're at low altitude or very low altitude, you draw 1 extra card. If you're at high altitude, you draw 1 fewer card, and if you're at very high altitude, you draw 2 fewer. Now this is where that little T there for turbocharged engines becomes important. At high altitude, a turbocharged aircraft draws the same number of cards that it would do at medium altitude. So the Spitfire Mark 14 would draw 3 cards at the end of its turn at very high altitude, and it would only suffer a -1 penalty at very high. Now compare this to the Focke-Wulf, which is not turbocharged. That would be -1 at high altitude, -2 at very high altitude. So that's one advantage the Spitfires have over this slightly older model of aircraft. And of course wingmen, these fellows have much simpler ratings. They function by drawing that number of cards on the offense when it's their turn, that number on the defense when they're attacked, and wingmen, like leaders, can be turbocharged. So at high altitude their ratings are completely unaffected, and at very high altitude the only penalty they suffer is a -1 to their defense. Their offensive capability is not affected. So, without further ado, let's get into a dogfight. Now, in the basic game, a dogfight is always 6 turns duration. This is quite a reasonable limit because in the fast, furious nature of air combat in this period, whether it's a boom and zoom or a swirling dogfight, you are likely to burn through a lot of fuel and or ammunition in a very short space of time. And also you'd probably lose your cohesion in terms of where you were vis-a-vis the rest of your formation. So I think 6 turns is reasonable. It also is one of the things that makes this game really compact, because although they have a turn track on one of the sheets they give you with the game, you don't actually need to use that. So I tend to just use spare damage counters to mark the passage of time. So we've set up our contending aircraft in a neutral position to one another. Players now would normally secretly select an altitude. So concealing their cards from each other, they would choose an altitude marker. Now the Germans, for this scenario, I'm going to assume have chosen medium. It's a good midway scenario for them. It's worth having height at the beginning of a scenario, but I'd assume the German player would also want to maximize his horsepower rating. For the British, starting at high altitude is feasible thanks to their turbocharged engines. So my hypothetical British player would start at high. To begin the game, once you reveal your starting altitudes and draw your starting hands, flip the game turn counter, and the axis have come up top, so I'll put that up there. And I will use that to show that it's turn 1. So the Germans go first. They've seen the British above them. Now normally in a turn your wingman goes first before your leader takes any actions. However, on turn 1, the wingman's action is always suspended for the side which goes first. That makes sense to me because at the end of the day, no matter how flexible your formation, your leader is ultimately following your wingman. So at the outset of an engagement, the German leader is not going to peel off an attack. He's going to follow his leader's lead. So the German sees the British aircraft above him, decides, because he has 7 cards in hand, which is a lot, that he's going to change his altitude from medium to high. The wingman step is always followed next by the change altitude step. Now you don't have to change altitude, but that's the point in your turn where you can do it automatically. To climb, you change your altitude marker 1 level up and you discard a card. The German has a lot of maneuver cards in hand, so he's going to discard one of those. Conversely, if you choose to dive, you draw a card. And drawing a card due to diving is the only time where you can exceed your hand limit. So the German climbs, and he decides he's going to go straight for the enemy leader. Now looking at his hand, it's obvious he feels pretty maneuverable, but also quite vulnerable. He has no cards that allow him to counter any reaction cards from the Brit. But he's going to try and make use of those maneuvering cards. He does have a very strong burst rating of 2. The Focke-Wulf is somewhat more heavily armed than the Spitfire. But he's going to try and make the British burn some defensive cards by maneuvering first, even though he's able to take a shot. So he plays a maneuver card. Looking at his hand, the British player also has a very aggressive hand, but not much by way of defense. So he's going to hang on to that because he can't counter a maneuvering card with a chop throttle anyway. So the German fighter maneuvers and the British aircraft allows it. So he moves from neutral to advantaged and his burst rating goes up by 1. So the German player's burst rating is now 3. Sensing his advantage, he's going to play another maneuvering card. Again, the Spitfire does not respond, and the German fighter is now as advantaged as it's possible to get in this game. He's tailing the British fighter, and his burst rating has gone up by a further 2 to 4. So he's reached the maximum number of increases to bursts he can get. Now he has some powerful firing cards. If that gets through, he could take out the British plane in a heartbeat. So he decides he's going to be cautious. He hasn't seen any response cards from the Brit yet, but he's wondering why this is, and the Brit still has a handful of cards. Maybe he has a trick up his sleeve. So he's going to try a ranging shot first, a fairly cautious one. The British player, as we've seen, only has that one precious evasion card, so he is going to accept the hits that the German lands on him, which thankfully is only 1 point of damage. So the big rugged Spitfire Mark 14 is easily able to shrug those hits off. But feeling a lot more confident about his chances now, the German player decides he's going to turn on the juice, cash in more of those burst points and try a fuel tank hit. Now that the British player cannot possibly ignore, not unless he wants to lose his plane. So he's going to go a bit Hollywoody and he's going to chop throttle, because that can negate an in my sights card. So you see, in my sights can be responded to with a chop throttle. Now the question for the German player, does he have any cards that can stop a chop throttle? That's no good. And neither is that. The German howls with frustration, and the British player, probably without taking his his hands off the controls, probably does a air punch or something, goes, yeah! So he lives a bit longer. The Focke-Wulf is now out of options. It can do no more with the hand it has. And because it's at high altitude, it draws 2 cards. Not bad. Gets another in my sights and another manoeuvring card. Play now passes to the British. Now, seeing that his leader is in trouble, the British wingman, not unnaturally, is going to go straight for that Focke-Wulf. And at this altitude, he can draw 3 cards per his offensive rating. He gets a tight turn, a full throttle, and an in my sights card. So the first thing he's going to do is play the full throttle to see if he can help his leader out. The German has no response to the full throttle, so that does help. Think of it as the wingman running interference and basically distracting the German leader. And if anything, he's actually going to get even more distracted, because the wingman is going to follow up by opening fire on him. None of his cards are effective against that. So the Spitfire is now no longer the only card in the game, aircraft card that is, that has had a few nicks taken out of its paintwork. Of course, the last card of the British wingman is a bit useless, so it just gets discarded. That was quite a creditable wingman turn. Now, at this stage, the British player could change altitude, but he's feeling lucky and he has a manoeuvre and a half loop card, so he's going to try and use them. He plays a manoeuvre against the Focke-Wulf, again to which the German player, much to his frustration, cannot respond. So he manages to shake off the enemy aircraft. And then to add insult to injury once more, he's going to throw a snazzy half loop and gain a Top Gun style dominance over his opponent. So in one deft move, he's put himself right on the German player's tail. Now, because of the swiftness of the maneuver, he bypasses the +1 he would get from moving from neutral to advantage. So he's gone straight to tailing. So it's only +2. He doesn't collect that extra +1 on the way. So his total bursts are now 3. That's still pretty respectable. And looking at his options, he'd actually do better to wear the German down with individual shots and force him to spread his defences thin. The British player, of course, in theory, has no way of knowing that the German has no effective response cards, certainly not against shooting in his hand. So just to rush through them, because he doesn't know it, but we know. He plays an in my sights for 1 hit, plays a second in my sights for a further 2 hits, and then for a good measure, an out of the sun for a further 2 hits. So that's 5 hits inflicted in total on the poor Focke-Wulf, and none of them have been deflected. So the German plane, or avoided I should say. So the German plane has now absorbed a total of 6 hits, which is enough to flip it to its damage side. Now note, its maximum capacity for damage is 7, so it is perilously close to being shot down. And of course, as you can see, its ratings are far weaker on the reverse side. So the British player has used up all his bursts and is rather pleased with himself. Because he's got turbocharged engines, he draws his full 3 cards. And it is now the start of turn 2. Now the Germans start this turn in a rather sticky situation, but before the leader has to worry about anything, the wingman is going to emulate his British counterpart's noble work by trying to pull his leader's fat out the fire. Now of course at high altitude only the defensive rating is affected, so the Focke-Wulf can draw 3 cards. That could be useful. So could that. That not so much. That little icon there shows that the wingman cannot use clouds offensively. However, he can use this as a response card against either of those 2 cards if the British player tries to play them. So he can't use the scissors card because his leader is being tailed rather than disadvantaged, but he could also use that to try and counter any British move. He is going to play the out of the sun card on the British leader. Looking at his hand, the British leader does the obvious thing and plays clouds, to which the German pilot laughs and counters the cloud move. The British can't counter that, so the Spitfire takes 2 hits. Good shooting. Unfortunately for the Germans, creditable though that is, the tough British plane just shrugs off the hits. And now it's up to the German leader. Now this is tricky. If he plays his cards right, he could turn the tables on his opponent. But one thing that he is going to do is dive, because he is now fighting at a disadvantage in the state his plane is in. So he dives, draws a card for diving. The British player elects to follow him. Now because he is tailing, there's no penalty. If he was advantaged, he would have to pay a card and then either draw one if he was diving after his victim or discard one if he was climbing. But because he's tailing, following is automatic. So he follows the German down, draws a card for diving. Ooh, nice one. And the German player is going to try and put his plan into operation. He first maneuvers. With only the 1 tight turn card, the British player reluctantly decides to let him do it. He then plays his scissors card. Again, the British player grits his teeth and just takes it. So he's now disadvantaged. That's some very fancy flying by the German. Incidentally, his burst rating is up to 3 now. And he's finally going to maneuver. Again, the Brit does nothing. So he's now being tailed and the German has 5 bursts on him. This is not going to be pleasant. The German fires, again a cautious ranging shot to begin with. Ordinarily, the British player would probably ignore it, but that 1 damage point is enough to take him over to a damaged state, so he feels he has no choice but to play his tight turn card to get away. The German does not respond, but he plays his very last card for 3 hits, to which the British player cannot respond. So the Spitfire has absorbed a total of 6 damage now as well. Ouch. And that has made rather a mess of it. He's now in an equally parlous situation, and notice on his reverse side he's lost the advantage of his turbocharged engine. So the playing field has been somewhat levelled now. Very happy with that result. The German player draws his 2 cards, and that's the end of his turn 2. So for the British turn 2, the other Spitfire does not like the look of this at all. He's going to draw 3 attack cards and come after the German who's going after his leader. Ooh, not the best, but he can play the manoeuvre card to try to help. With very few options, the German player decides to do nothing about that, so the British leader at least is only disadvantaged now. But he has very poor options at the moment. He's going to risk climbing. He's not going to be playing that card anytime soon, so he ditches it, gets himself back up to high altitude, and he leaves the German player with an interesting choice. Should he follow or not? Now, following would be foolhardy because he would have to lose both of those cards. One for following because he's only advantaged, and the second for climbing. The German very sensibly opts to let the British fighter go. So they've temporarily broken contact. At high altitude, the Brit only draws 1 card now. That brings his hand back up to 4, but he's still lacking defensive cards. That's not brilliant. It is now the beginning of turn 3. The German wingman can do nothing because there's no hostiles at the same altitude. The German player is tempted sorely to climb and settle accounts with the British fighter. If he ditches his tight turn card to climb, he could stake everything on a last shot. The question is it worth it? He decides that it is. And it's high risk, but the rewards could be incredible. So he's going to do it. He cashes in his tight turn card to climb, and he takes a snapshot at the British leader. The gamble pays off. The British leader has no defensive cards, and that one hit is enough to shoot him down. So what happens now is we remove the British wingman card, and the wingman in effect becomes the new leader. He receives a replacement hand of cards. The former leader's hand is discarded, but -1 to represent the shock of watching his leader shot down. So he only gets 7 cards. It's not going well for the British, although the German leader is hanging on by a thread. And most significantly, he only draws 1 card after that turn. He's going to have to depend on that tight turn to see him through, because it is now the British player's turn, and you can be sure that fellow is going to want some revenge for what's just happened. And sure enough, he goes for it. Manoeuvring against the German plane, the German leader does not dare commit that tight turn to anything other than a gun attack, because he is quite ready to fall out the sky at the slightest provocation. So the British player has lined up on him now. He's going to tease him a bit more to test his defences a little. Again, there's no response. And so satisfied, the British player prepares his attack. Goes for it. That's overkill. The German desperately plays his tight turn. But unfortunately for him, the British pilot's obviously ready for this, and a quick scissors negates the tight turn. The attack goes through, and the German leader is shot down. Quite a dramatic round, this one. So that effectively ends the British pilot's turn because he is engaged and shot down his mark. As per the British pilot a bit earlier, the former German wingman, now the leader, receives a new hand -1 card. And the British player, who of course is now an undamaged aircraft, draws 3 cards despite being at high altitude because of his turbocharged engines. So, start of turn 4, we're exactly halfway through the dogfight. How is this going to play out? The German doesn't have many manoeuvring options, but he can throw in that fairly powerful attack to open the ball, and he's going to do it. The British player has a good number of defensive cards in hand, and he's going to try and respond. He doesn't want to lose his best ones just yet, so he's going to chuck in a barrel roll, to which the German player responds. That was a bit of a miscalculation on the Brit's part. Perhaps if he'd used a tight turn it might have been better, but no matter. The attack only inflicts 2 hits, which is not really enough to worry him just yet. He probably doesn't want to absorb that again on a future turn. The German player can make no further moves, so he draws 2 cards, gets a vertical roll and a half loop. Good cards. The British player decides he doesn't want that plane's guns anywhere near him, so he's going to maneuver. The German player has defensive cards, but nothing that can stop a maneuver, so he's going to accept it. Slightly more optimistic now, the British player plays another maneuver card to get firmly on his tail. So far, so good. The only problem is he's now down to his last 3 cards, and he has no firing cards, so he can't exploit the situation. So sighing deeply, he waits for an opportunity by drawing his end of turn cards, and oh look, if he can just maintain his position, he might well get that German the next turn. It is now turn 5. The German player, of course, has no intention of letting any of this happen. And he is tempted to stay at this altitude because there's no particular disadvantage to him, other than the fact that he's been tailed. But maybe, just to maximize his advantage, he's going to dive, gain an extra card, see what he gets. Not too bad. The British player, not unnaturally, is going to follow him down. Not too bad. So the German is going to open the ball by playing his half loop card. The British player quickly confirms he has no response to that, so the German has wriggled out of the trap very ably. He is then going to commence making some attacks. Starts off with a fairly weak card, again testing the British defences. The British player is being equally cautious and will respond with a barrel roll. The German player could, if he wanted to, use his ace pilot to get rid of the barrel roll, but it seems hardly worth it, and that additional damage point doesn't even flip the British card to its damaged state. But of course the German is not finished. He was only probing his opponent. He's going to follow up with a somewhat stronger attack card now. This is rather more serious. The British player tight turns away from the barrage. The German responds with a scissors, to which the Brit has no answer. That takes the damage up to 5. And flips the British card. Things are looking rather bad now. A very good turn completed for him. The German draws his 3 cards. Ooh, another half loop and more attacks. This is going to be a tough one for the British. Still, I'm sure he's feeling fairly game about it. He's got a half loop card as well, and he intends to use it. The German could stop it with his ace pilot, but he's feeling rather cautious. Don't want to get too overconfident in victory and burn a card unnecessarily, so he's going to accept it. Besides, it means the British burst rating is only 3. The British player accepting the loss of a burst card, a burst point, is going to play that card in the hope of finishing his opponent right now. Unfortunately for him, because it's a good old standard in my sights, the play of a simple barrel roll is enough to let the German off the hook. The British player sighs deeply, draws his 2 cards, and it is now the final turn of the game. Now, the only problem for the German player is in accepting the British manoeuvre the previous turn. He is now unable to bring his guns to bear, although he does have a half loop card. He's not going to take the chance of the Brit following him, so he's going to play the half loop straight away and just go for it. The British player cannot respond, and so as the German ably turns his nimble craft round, 2 bursts is exactly what he wants to do that. If the shot passes through, the British fighter will be shot down. Taking a bit of a risk, the British player decides to counter with a tight turn. Ordinarily, that would be great, but sensing victory, the German plays ace pilot, to which the British pilot has no response. The 2 damage bring him up to 7, and the other Spitfire is down. So there we have it. Last round of the game saw the Germans score a decisive win. Now, the dogfights in this game are largely governed by the destruction of the other side, or they can break off. But there is also a points element to it. So each Spitfire was worth 9, well, the Spitfire leader was worth 9 points, the Focke-Wulf leader worth 7, and their wingmen were worth +4 and +3 respectively. Now, in order to balance the scenario, that means that the German players started with an advantage in points, and so the onus was on the British to win the game rather handily and without casualties, if possible, for a decisive win on points. Of course, they failed to do that, so it is a clear German victory. Yes, that's... well, that was some impressive flying by the Focke-Wulfs. I was secretly rooting for the Spitfires, but unfortunately it was simply not their day. But in any case, I hope that rather fast and furious exchange has given you an idea of how dogfights work, pure dogfights, the classic bones of Down in Flames. If you would like me to demonstrate any other elements of this game, or you've got any questions, or even tactical hints and suggestions, could I have played either side better? I do welcome the comments. But most of all, thank you very much for your company, and thank you for tuning in.